Alexander Shkudun. The Death Watcher. Death is the darkened side of the mirror, without which we would see nothing. Saul Bellow. The evening was warm. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving the city under the reign of darkness. There was no wind, only the occasional flutter of papers and fallen leaves rising from the pavement hinted at its invisible presence. In this courtyard, life itself seemed to have come to a halt. No buzzing cars, no couples kissing on benches, only a certain tension in the air and a faint electric charge, like the one that lingers after a thunderstorm. A short, 26-year-old man with dark eyes and closely cropped dark hair stood at the entrance of a high-rise building, smoking pensively. He took long drags, glancing around as if searching for someone. Now and then, he looked down at his expensive watch, fully aware that she always arrived on time, which meant he still had 10 minutes to wait. He took his final drag. He smoked rarely, but when he did, he savored it like fine wine. Exhaling through his nose, he watched the smoke drift. The butt flew to the pavement, and he ground it out with the toe of his boot.
"Nice day,"
he said to himself, sinking back into thought. On the 5th floor of a newly built 18-story building, a general was dying in his bed. He lay on his back, staring at the ceiling with contempt, saying nothing to the family members gathered at his side. Everything had already been said. In his will. He didn't want to see their tears, didn't want to hear their sobs and dishonest assurances that everything would be fine. Such behavior, even from loved ones, was unbecoming in the presence of a soldier, even a retired one. The general wanted just one thing: to leave this world quietly and calmly, to face his fate with dignity. Like a soldier. He had been through a lot in his 65 years. He had seen much, understood much. He had grown disillusioned with life and lost faith in justice. He realized smoking was harmful, that taking a mistress while having a beautiful wife and promising to share all joys and sorrows with her alone was wrong. He came to understand that robbing the people and taking bribes turned a man into a pathetic, spineless creature, unworthy of being called human. The general had rethought many things. He had asked forgiveness from all those he had known, and had forgiven each of them in turn. He held no bitterness in his heart. He bore no grudges, and had no regrets for things left undone. A perfect truth of this world had been revealed to him. Life is the filthiest and most vile game ever devised by a cunning puppeteer, because no one is allowed to win it. For 3 days, the general had lain motionless, taking nothing but water. His stomach had failed, ravaged by cancer, and medicine could do nothing. He lived in wait for death. He called for her, hoping to die in sleep, not in agony. But on the 3rd day, life still refused to release him. His body, broken by disease, lay limp on white sheets, feeling nothing but weariness. He closed his eyes, wondering how and when it would all finally end. A tall figure in a long black cloak was slowly approaching the building. Her shoes made no sound as they moved along the pavement, carrying their wearer forward. Every movement the woman made radiated quiet strength and a sense of hidden superiority. As she neared the entrance, she slowed slightly. She cast a quick glance at the young man standing right by the door. With a brief nod of acknowledgement, she continued on. The guy discreetly checked his watch, gave a satisfied hum, and followed her. The elderly concierge, seated behind a glass partition near the entrance, continued reading her romance novel, having noticed nothing at all. They entered the apartment together, the tall brunette with a cloak flowing behind her, and the dark-haired guy who barely looked like a full-grown man. The woman surveyed the spacious wood-paneled hallway and frowned in disapproval. Though the general had been a soldier, he clearly didn't tidy up often. His shoes were scattered near the wall-mouth closet. Souvenir trinkets on a shelf had gathered gray dust and turned dull. Cobwebs were starting to form in the corners of the ceiling. A chair at the far end of the hall completed the picture. Draped in hastily discarded clothes, the girl glanced at the boy and simply shook her head. She oriented herself instantly and confidently walked into the open door on the right, leading into the room where everything was happening. The general lay with his eyes closed. Two men stood near his bed, darker than shadows. A woman, likely his wife, sat on a stool nearby, pressing a handkerchief to her face in silence, occasionally letting out a sob. She had long since run out of tears. Too many had already been shed. The men stood firm, their expressions showing the weight of their grief. Their faces were pale, their eyes wet. The brunette stepped closer. She looked down at the man lying on the bed.
"It's time,"
she whispered after a moment and touched his forehead with her hand. The room darkened. Her hand began to glow with a bluish light, drawing the last remnants of life from his body and helping his soul break free from the prison of flesh.
"You are free now."
As if hearing those words, a strange substance began to separate from the body, something like a glowing, ghostly mist. It hovered over the gathered people for a few seconds, then slowly ascended, dissolving as it rose. A moment later, it vanished completely. Naturally, the people in the room saw none of this. Perhaps they felt a faint discomfort, a subtle shift in the room's energy, but outwardly nothing changed. Except the general's features, which softened, losing their former severity.
"That's how it happens, Watcher,"
the woman said, pulling the young man from his stupor. She smiled.
"First time?"
The young man licked his dry lips and gave a hesitant nod.
"The first time is always intense. After that, you get used to it."
She said no more. Turning her back on the lifeless body, she walked calmly out of the room. There was still much work ahead of her today. A second later, the general's wife began to sob, realizing her husband was gone. She dropped to her knees beside him, took his hand and pressed her forehead to it. The men tried to comfort her, but she was devastated, mourning the loss of the person dearest to her. The Watcher stood behind them all, unable to shake what had just happened. Tears welled up in his eyes, on their own. Yes, he had known what he was getting into. He knew what he would see. His duty was to observe the coming of death, and later report that no one but the intended soul had perished. He had been trained for this role for 2 years. He had heard countless times what happens when a person's time comes. He had sat through lecture after lecture about the grand design and the fates of all living beings. And still, in practice, it was different. A life had been taken. He couldn't wrap his head around how a simple touch could sever a man's thread of destiny, even if that destiny had reached its end. Even if it was meant to be, it felt like murder. He looked at the general one last time. He wanted a cigarette. He wanted to run far away without looking back. Were people really nothing but puppets of fate? Was there truly no way to change anything?
"I don't believe it.
The boy whispered, clenching his fists.
I don't believe it."
Overwhelmed with doubt, he quietly left the apartment. He walked down the stairs to the first floor and past the concierge unnoticed, stepping out into the fresh air. Only outside did the Watcher allow himself to release the flood of emotion and pain. Along with his breakfast, Artyom had left his body a few years ago. An accident. A train en route to Kislovodsk derailed, burying more than 300 people beneath its wreckage. It happened at night, while the young man was asleep. All he had time to do was feel a flash of fear, not understanding what was happening. He hit a table as he fell from the top bunk. And that was it. There was no dark tunnel with a light at the end. No beautiful angels in white robes, as described by so many writers. No celestial music, no gates of heaven. There was nothing except pain. Sharp, unbearable, incomprehensible. His body screamed in agony. It writhed as if trying to shake off an invisible press, crushing it from within, stabbing every cell with unseen needles. And then a quiet voice asked,
Do you want to live?
Of course.
Artyom shouted with all his might.
So be it. You've fallen outside the design of death. From now on, you will become one of her watchers.
Who are you?
There was no answer, only a fog clouding his eyes and a darkness rolling over his consciousness like a phantom avalanche. Artyom woke up on an operating table. He lay there, staring blankly into the blinding surgical light, trying to grasp the meaning of that voice's words. You will become one of her watchers.
Like hell I will.
He tried to say with a disobedient tongue.
Relax, everything is fine. Don't try to speak. You're still too weak.
3 men in surgical masks leaned over him.
Your life is not in danger. Now get some rest.
No. Wait.
Artyom jerked toward the faces, but something cold touched his hand, and within 2 seconds the sedative took effect. It happened the next day, in his hospital room, while Artyom was lying under an IV drip. A soft knock on the door, more out of habit than courtesy, and 2 people entered, a man and a woman. She wore a form-fitting black dress. The man was in light blue jeans and a white sweater. Carefully, they sat on the edge of Artyom's bed and smiled at him like old friends.
Who are you?
The young man asked in a stronger voice, scanning the strangers with suspicion.
We're just like you.
The woman said.
Death Watchers.
The man added. Artyom looked them over, clearly unconvinced. Still, he held back the harsh words threatening to burst out.
Why are you here?
To teach you.
The woman said, locking eyes with his deep black gaze.
To teach me what?
Life.
The man smirked, like a teacher amused by a child's naive question.
Real life, not the kind you're used to.
I don't understand.
Artyom tried to sit up, but the woman firmly shook her head and pointed to the IV drip.
You'll understand soon. We'll help you, but it's not time yet. Your mind needs to absorb this information in fragments, otherwise it might reject it or go mad. Everything we're going to tell you contradicts what you've been taught since childhood, so gather your strength. You'll need it to grasp the world you now inhabit.
She gently took his hand.
The thing is, you've crossed the boundary of human life. No, you haven't ceased to exist. Your physical shell is still with you, but you've stepped into a new level of perception, one that's closed to ordinary people. You've arrived in the real world, the mother world, the one where life began, Adam and Eve, Cain and his brother, Noah and the great flood.
What, the world where it all began? What are you talking about? What does this mean?
All in due time. Be patient and you'll find out. We'll be back tomorrow. Think about what I've told you. For now, sleep.
What is this, seriously? Artyom stirred. Always with the sleep,
Sleep helps your mind sort things into place.
the man said, reading his thoughts.
Until tomorrow, Artyom.
If Artyom had heard his name then, he might have started pinching himself to check if he was dreaming. He might have stared at the strange pair and asked dumb questions about how they knew him, but he heard nothing. He was already falling into a sudden, inexplicable sleep. For the next few days, his mentors, as they called themselves, came to speak with him. Artyom learned a lot. He often widened his eyes in disbelief, ran to the bathroom to splash cold water on his face, made the sign of the cross while the young couple smirked, and thought about his parents. He didn't believe everything. I mean, really, how could anyone believe that people don't die, but merely transition into a different state of existence? That death itself doesn't even exist? Her messengers only help souls fulfill the grand design, opening the way to the real world? Or that every human has a destiny, scheduled down to the very second? How could anyone believe such a thing? Because if you do, You're basically admitting that people are just controlled beings. And tell me, does it feel good to realize you're a puppet on strings? Artyom experienced nervous breakdowns. He wasn't ready to accept what he was being shown. He drifted into fragmented dreams for hours, thinking through everything he'd heard. He dreamt of ordinary people, unaware of what they were doing, walking across a narrow, shaky wooden bridge stretched between two chasms. He pitied them, deeply pitied those blind kittens, living only by what they could see, incapable of peeking into the book of their own fates. After being discharged from the hospital, escorted out by the same man and woman, unnoticed by the entire medical staff, and after being transported in just seconds to a temple in Shanghai, Artyom was ready to believe anything. They trained him for 2 years. They broke down his habits, his ways of thinking. They retrained him to grasp the foundations of existence and how to use intuition. He discarded everything he'd learned in kindergarten, school, and university. Artyom began to see the human world as it truly was, a field of energy and information. He learned to control the inner power every human is born with, drawing it from the endless stream of the universe. With willpower alone, he could cross vast distances, influence matter. And the more he learned, the less he wanted to remain in the world of people. It seemed flawed, constrained, unfair, and cruel. But the universal design demanded that Artyom fulfill the duties of a Death Watcher. Even his fate was governed by destiny. Even he was a puppet, not as blind or insignificant as humans, but a puppet nonetheless. Artyom smiled at the memory. How long ago it all seemed. And yet, what were 2 years in their world? A grain of sand in the vast clockwork of the universe. The young man stood in the middle of a quiet road that morning, trying to picture what would happen here in just a few minutes. It was hard to believe that this peaceful, seemingly safe place would become the site of a deadly crash. An ordinary, well-maintained stretch of road, smooth, wide, no sharp turns, no ice. Winter was over, and yet it was here that death would appear. He glanced at the pack of cigarettes sticking out of his jacket pocket, sighed, and turned his eyes back to the road. Just a little longer to wait. Vitaly Nikiforovich Smolin had left early that morning to pick up a shipment, planning to finish work ahead of schedule and be home by lunchtime. It was his daughter's 13th birthday. For 20 years, he'd driven his old Gazelle truck, delivering electronics from the factory to one of the local supermarkets. The job wasn't burdensome. In fact, it brought him joy. Vitaly loved the road. Since childhood, he had dreamed of becoming a bus driver. And in a way, that dream had partially come true. The full route measured exactly 231 kilometers and 400 meters. Smolin had reset the odometer multiple times before arriving at this number. Always trying to optimize the distance, he looked for shortcuts. He studied maps carefully and shook his head with regret whenever he realized there was no better option. Only once had he managed to cut off nearly a kilometer at the cost of his muffler, which fell off after a jolt on a curb. After that, Vitaly gave up trying to save gas for the Gazelle and simply filled out the route sheet carefully, 240 kilometers, no more, no less. Traffic was light, and Smolin drove contentedly, humming to himself. 3 minutes later, right on schedule, he pulled onto the highway. Vitaly had no way of knowing that just a few thousand meters ahead, an armored black SUV belonging to a government deputy was barreling toward him at 220 kilometers per hour. Nor could he guess that in 5 minutes, the drunken legislator would fall asleep at the wheel and veer into the oncoming lane. The sound of brakes, a screech, a horrifying head-on collision. Artyom stood just 20 paces from the crash. Everything happened exactly as it was meant to. This time, The messenger of death appeared just seconds after the impact. A different girl, blonde, with strikingly beautiful features and blue eyes. She nodded at Artyom and slowly walked toward the overturned SUV. Apparently, the drivers were meant to live a little longer. She stood for a moment in front of the black hunk of useless metal that used to be a car, then continued on. Artyom turned pale. It wasn't the deputy who was supposed to die in this accident. It was the driver of the Gazelle. His jaw tightened. He swallowed hard, nearly crying out loud.
Where's the justice? Don't tell me even here there is none.
Meanwhile, the girl knelt beside Vitaly. The diligent driver hadn't fastened his seatbelt and had been thrown through the windshield onto the road. He was dying. His eyes were open, and a thin stream of blood trickled from his mouth. The blonde leaned over him, and a knowing smile appeared on Smolin's face.
There will be no pain,
Whispered the messenger of death, returning his smile, and gently touched his forehead. Artyom approached silently from behind.
This I'll never be able to understand or accept,
He said to her, looking at the man who had left this world in such a senseless way.
No one's asking you to.
The girl replied, turning her eyes downward. Did he imagine it, or were her eyes really filled with a quiet sorrow and grief?
Answer me one question.
Artyom leaned in close to her face.
Why do you need watchers? Why?
For a moment, Death hesitated. The boy clearly saw that she wanted to speak, wanted to say aloud what should never be said.
Answer me.
From the right came the sound of sirens. An ambulance was approaching. 2 minutes later, it pulled up to the crash site, and 3 people in white coats rushed out. They inspected the SUV and pulled out the injured deputy, who was bleeding heavily.
Get him in the ambulance, now!
Barked the oldest one.
Give him painkillers, hurry. He might not make it to the hospital.
Alexei Gennadovich is 5 minutes from here. Try to call him a plane.
Looking female medic as she administered the injection.
Less talking, more action, move.
The deputy was loaded into the ambulance.
Nezarov, what's taking you so long?
The man being addressed stood in front of the Gazelle, staring at the driver's body.
Oleg, I checked him. Unfortunately, he's dead.
Alexei Gennadovich joined his colleague and lowered his gaze.
So, that's how it happens.
Oleg said philosophically.
Let's at least call the police.
Alexei nodded. He took out his phone and dialed.
Yes, Highway 53, accident, as far as I can tell, head-on collision. 1 driver in critical condition. We're taking him to the 15th department.
That bastard will survive.
Artyom stood nearby, listening as the medic spoke to the officer.
That bastard.
It wouldn't finish. He suddenly dashed after the blonde girl, only just realizing that death never waits for anyone. Inside the ambulance, in addition to the deputy on a stretcher, there was a girl lying under a ventilator. Young, not even 20.
No,
Artyom whispered, growing pale.
not her, please, not her.
The messenger of death gave him an apologetic look, shrugged slightly, and touched the girl's forehead with her hand.
You can't change anything, no matter how painful or sad it may be. It's all...
Yeah. The great design.
Artyom waved dismissively and brought the tea bowl to his lips, taking a sip.
But the design is unfair.
They sat in a wooden gazebo near the edge of a cliff, beyond which a majestic waterfall cascaded down the slope. Master and student meeting this morning for a tea ceremony.
Seeker, what do you know of justice? You judge only by what you see, yet so much remains hidden from you, so much you simply cannot understand.
What I see is enough,
said Artyom, taking another sip.
The mind of the higher being cannot be reduced to your idea of good and evil, of crime and punishment.
You don't understand.
To me, I share your doubts. I know what stirs within your soul. But think of this too, Seeker. The death of that young girl will lead her grieving lover to create a great musical masterpiece, one that will later unite many hearts and form new families. And Vitaly Smolin's wife will marry again and give birth to a son who will one day become the president of the country, ready to give his soul for the good of the people.
Artyom turned the tea bowl in his hands and remained silent.
You're too attached to individuals, Watcher. You're still bound by human dogmas and rules. You're too sentimental.
The old man, dressed in an orange robe and sitting directly across from him, peered intently into his eyes.
The great design accounts for everything. It doesn't concern itself with trivialities. Everything in life is interconnected. All events are woven together and shape the future.
Thank you for the tea, Master.
Artyom stood from the soft rug, placed his cup on the crystal table, and left, leaving the elder alone with his thoughts. The maternity ward was stuffy. Clearly the temperature was carefully regulated even in warmer seasons. Artyom walked through the corridor, searching for the right operating room. In his past life, he had never started a family. In this one, he wouldn't have minded, if only he wasn't so busy. Maybe later, he thought, smiling at the nurses he passed, instantly making them forget he existed. Passing a massive glass wall behind which tiny newborns lay in little tubs, Artyom smiled. He scanned the room warmly, watching the mothers breastfeeding, trying to guess the fate written for each of these children. The room he was looking for turned out to be the last one. He pressed the handle and quickly stepped inside. A woman lay on the operating table. 3 men and 1 woman surrounded her. 2 surgeons, an anesthesiologist, and a nurse, Artyom noted silently and stepped closer.
Her blood pressure's dropping. We'll have to do a C-section. She can't deliver naturally,
Came a voice from the right.
It's risky. Pulse is weak. Nurse, injection. We need to support her heart,
Said the left surgeon, calmly, though there was a tremble in his tone.
You're right. Pulse is slowing. 20 milliliters.
Artyom wasn't watching the operating table. His attention had shifted to 2 shadows slowly materializing in the room. 2 girls he knew all too well, a brunette and a blonde, harbingers of death.
It's not working. We're losing her. Heart stopping. We have to save the baby.
The blonde calmly stepped to the table and looked into the woman's face. The mother's brown eyes seemed to see her. They spoke in tears, pleading, hoping for mercy, not for herself, for the child. Artyom broke into a sweat. His hands trembled, his chest ached with intensity.
Prepare the defibrillator. Clear.
The surgeon's frightened voice shouted.
Once, twice, 3 times. Again.
Artyom, I never told you why we need watchers.
The blonde stared into the woman's eyes, gently stroking her hair.
It's because even we sometimes feel tempted to take the wrong soul. But do you know what stops us?
There's a chance her pulse is stabilizing.
Oh no, not you. Watchers who can destroy us if necessary.
The girl shifted her gaze to Artyom.
We're stopped by the great design, which cannot harm humanity and only acts for the greater good.
With those words, the blonde touched the woman's forehead. The monitor let out a weak beep. A flat white line ran across the screen.
We lost her.
Artyom closed his eyes. Unbearable rage boiled in his chest. The brunette stepped forward.
You won't dare.
Artyom's voice turned threatening. He grabbed Death's hand.
You won't dare.
Come, we must save the baby. Nurse, scalpel.
Nothing can be changed, Artyom. It's already been decided. The baby must die.
If you take one more step, I'll kill you.
The blonde laughed.
Naive boy. Do you think we came together by accident? If you kill one of us without cause, you will vanish from existence. The other will fulfill the design. We've read your book of fate, Watcher.
She stepped toward the mother's body.
You won't do it.
Artyom shouted, lunging forward. The messenger of death touched the mother's womb, and Artyom's vision swirled. He thrust out his hands and covered the brunette's palms with his own. His head felt like it exploded. His heart stopped. Blood trickled from his nose. Artyom no longer felt his legs or body, straining with all his might not to let go of Death's hands resting on the dead woman's belly. The child must live. The world around him cracked at the seams. It burst like a soap bubble, like a volcano at the moment of its eruption. The blonde was yelling something. The brunette tried to break free from Artyom's grip. A milky fog blurred his vision. Breathing became unbearable. Every breath came with struggle, every exhale with pulsing pain. Don't let go, never let go. Artyom tried to do the unthinkable, the impossible. He was transferring his energy, his life, to the small bundle of flesh inside the mother. Just one more moment, a bit more. A fair-haired boy in a white suit peeked into the room, eyes wide and unsure like a schoolchild. So he did it? He actually did it? Artyom slowly slumped to the floor. He could barely think. His heart wasn't beating. He was dying. The two girls had vanished without a trace. As they should have. Death was no longer there. How much time had passed? A year, 300, eternity? A blinding flash of light forced him to shut his eyes. Near the operating table, a ghostly figure materialized out of thin air. A beautiful green-nabed girl with flowing hair took shape and appeared before the world. A long white cloak slid from her shoulders, and a medallion shaped like a dove hung around her neck. Artyom smiled. Life. The stranger raised her hand, and a greenish glow enveloped the woman's body. Another wave of her hand, and the cry of a newborn boy reached Artyom's ears. The blond boy, the life watcher, stood frozen, staring at the girl in awe. So it's his first time? Artyom smiled again. You have so much yet to learn. About existence, about the great design, about life and death. The thought faded. Artyom saw the green eyes of the stranger. They sparkled like emeralds, like two stars in the night sky. A second later, life itself bowed her head before him. Artyom was dying, and the only phrase he managed to utter before his death echoed for a long time in the ears of the life watcher.
Destiny can be changed.
Kyiv, 7 of May 2006.